Okay, and we should be live right now. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mipa. I'm from Housing Court Answers, and today I'm here with Josh Goldfine from Legal Aid Society, and he has hosting this training today for on housing rights and immigrants, housing rights of immigrants and access to shelter. Um, we know there's been a lot of changes regarding immigrant rights. So thank you to Mr. Goldfine for clarifying those rights in relation to shelter and housing in New York City. Um, and hopefully we can all get some good information out of it. Just to let everybody know, the slides, they will not be shared post the training, but this training will be on our website. It is being recorded, so you can always just feel free to check back on the training. And we will be taking questions throughout the training, so feel free to put your questions on the chat on the side, and that we will answer them as we go throughout. But I am going to turn over to Mr. Goldfine.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Goldfine. I'm a staff attorney in the Homeless Rights Project at the Legal Aid Society. I use he, him pronouns. We are a small team that advocates around the right to shelter in New York City and also tries to get people into permanent housing or keep them in permanent housing and prevent them from becoming homeless in the first place. So there's a lot happening on this topic, and um, I think we expect to see changes in the future, but I thought that I would start by just outlining, where we are right now, and then we can stop along the way and take questions. It might be easiest if you have a question, if you either put it in the chat or if you raise your hand um, using that feature, and then hopefully it will bump you to the top and I can see that. Um, so, uh, you know, we have a right to shelter in New York City, and that is because of court orders, and we are the lawyers on those cases. So that is primarily what we focus on. But the number one goal, of course, for everyone is getting them into permanent housing or trying to make sure that they stay in their permanent housing. Um, the reason that we have a right to shelter again is because of court orders, and the court orders say that everyone who is in need of a shelter bed on any given night in New York City should get a bed. And that's been true for over 40 years. So the city chooses to send people to different intake points based on their household composition. They have a separate shelter system for single adults, for families with children, and then for what they call adult families, people with no minor children in their household. They also operate a network of shelters for um, people who have been on the street and need a place to go and have been unwilling to come to shelter before. And then they have, those are all shelters that are operated by the city's Department of Homeless Services. But then there are other agencies that also operate shelters for instance, survivors of domestic violence, for people who have had some kind of disaster, like a fire or a flood or the city vacate order, and for people who um, may have HIV or AIDS. There are a number of different agencies that in different ways provide shelter to serve the population that they work with. But in the end, the New York City Department of Homeless Services is sort of um, the bottom line safety net. If you have nowhere else to go, either because you can't access one of those other kind of agency beds or they're all full, you can always go to the intake of the New York City Department of Homeless Services. And rather than sort of try to keep track of where those different intake offices are, you should just know that you can always call 311 and ask them. If you're, have somebody who needs shelter, 311 can guide you to the appropriate shelter intake office for that household. Um, so, uh, one of the things that we do in trying to monitor the shelter system and make sure that there's going to be enough beds for everyone is that we keep track of how many vacant beds there are in the system. If it seems like they're going to run out of beds for instance, single adult men, then we would, um, we reach out to them and say, hey, what's going on? It seems like, you're getting close to capacity. Um, what's your plan for getting through the next period of time and making sure that you have enough beds? So about 3 years ago, we noticed that was happening for families primarily. And we asked them for a meeting and they said, oh, well, what's going on is we have all these people coming from the southern border. Um, and they're coming to our family intake, which is called PATH in the South Bronx. And uh, we hadn't anticipated that. So um, we're getting close to running out of space for families with children. Um, Now, this was happening around the time that all of the COVID eviction preventions were coming to an end. So there was also definitely a factor of more people were coming into shelter in 2022 than had been in the previous 2 years, because during COVID, the height of COVID, we had protections in place to keep people from being evicted. But it so happened that around the time that people started to get evicted again, that was also when we had this issue that people were coming suddenly from the southern border in ways that they um, had never been in a volume that we had not seen before. And at that point, the city came to us and said, listen, we have this order. It says that there's a right to shelter, that everybody who's here, should get a bed. But they said, well, that just applies to New Yorkers, right? That doesn't apply to all these other people. And we said, no, it says what it says. We're not going to, require people to demonstrate that they've been here for a certain amount of time. We don't want to open the door to those kinds of conversations. It's a city of immigrants, and we certainly don't want people to be living on the street, particularly young families with children. Everybody has to get a bed. And so that led to a long period of negotiations over what it was that the city was actually required to do and how they were going to meet the need. And out of that negotiation, the city began to set up shelters with agencies that had never operated shelters before, including health and hospitals and the mayor's office of emergency management, um, to serve this population. And eventually, you may have seen reports about this. What happened was the city went to court actually and tried to say we shouldn't have a right to shelter anymore. It's too complicated. It's too hard. No one expected that all these folks would come from the southern border, and we can't manage it, and we shouldn't be obligated to provide shelter anymore. Um, in the end, we settled that application that they had made. The right to shelter remains in place. They did not get what they were asking for, but what we agreed to was that there would be, a whole new shelter system set up to serve the population that they were, complaining was overwhelming their system. So the reason that they wanted to have a different set of services for these new arrivals, the newest New Yorkers, was because the existing shelter system is designed to get people as quickly as possible back into their community. It assumes that people were either evicted or they were doubled up in a situation where they couldn't stay anymore. But they're New Yorkers. They have a tie to a community. They want to go back to that community. Um, and the role of the Department of Homeless Services is to, you know, get people on their feet, connect them with whatever housing subsidies or benefits that they're entitled to, and um, and then move them back into the community. And it was, um, in their view, those tools were not going to be effective for these new immigrants who were arriving in New York with no prior connection to New York. They weren't eligible for the public assistance programs, at least at first, that the city uses to move people into permanent housing. They didn't have any familiarity with any part of the city, so they didn't, have a particular place that they wanted to be. Um, the sort of regular case management services that the city shelter system normally provides to people, they said were not appropriate. They wanted to have a different path to connect, to train their staff to help the new arrivals with the kinds of things that the assistance that they could get and help people get, connected to employment certainly as soon as possible. And then they could, move on. And what we found was that most of the people who were coming from the southern border only wanted shelter for a couple of weeks. Most people left within 3 or 4 weeks. Um, and so it was a very different um, set of needs than what the usual, New York City Department of Homeless Services clients were looking for. It's also true that it's very difficult for them to open shelters. And if they were going to try to open sites that would be equivalent to what they have in the regular shelter system, it just wasn't going to be possible. Every time they open a new shelter, they're met with opposition from that community. It takes a long time. They end up making lots of compromises in order to sort of get through the process. And there was just no way they were going to be able to meet the volume. So they needed to be able to use, in order to keep everybody indoors, they said they were going to need to open shelters that didn't look like the kinds of shelters that we'd seen before. And so we negotiated about like what were the minimum standards. You can make it different than what we've seen in the past, what's required. But it has to be temporary, and we have to make sure that it's still going to be safe, and protect people in the way that they're entitled to be protected. So out of that agreement, the city, has set up, a couple hundred shelters. At one point, they had 4,000 people arriving a week, who were in need of a placement. And that's on top of the people that they were already serving. So at one point, the number of people in the new arrival shelters was even greater than the number of people in the regular DHS shelters. So it was overwhelming for them. And to their credit, they, for the most part, were able to open enough places and shelter everybody. There was one moment 2 summers ago when they deliberately left some men sleeping on the sidewalk outside the intake office because they wanted to generate that press. We asked to go to court, and at that point, magically, the beds opened and everybody got off the sidewalk. So we know that when that happened, wasn't actually because they ran out of beds. It's because they wanted to create those images. But other than that, and there were some nights when people were sort of waiting for a placement all night. But in the end, everybody got a placement. Um, and we did not have, like you saw in other parts of the country, families with children or single adults who were on the street because they had nowhere to go. They also set up a system to identify, in their view, it was to encourage people to move on. But basically, they announced it as a time limit. In fact, the way it works is if they tell you after a certain number of days, if you're staying in one of these new arrival shelters, that your time is up. And depending on how old you are, who's in your household, it could be 30 or 60 days. But the vast majority of people in that situation who reached the limit of days that the city was going to provide, got a new placement if they still needed a placement. Um, whether it was because they had applied for asylum and now were eligible for public assistance, or because they could show that they, were getting ready to move somewhere else, if they had a disability. Um, the process forced people to come back on a regular basis and reassert their need for shelter. But in practice, the way it worked was, this was a sort of a bureaucratic treadmill. It wasted a lot of people's time, but in the end, almost everybody got another shelter placement. Um, that's different than the way that the regular DHS shelters operate, but um, the plan that they made, the process that they created was within the limits of what the state would allow them to do. So they were able to set that up and operate it, and they continue to operate it. In doing these kinds of trainings in the past, we have had materials that lay all this process out, but I'm not sure how much longer that's going to be accurate or relevant or an operation. So that's one reason why I'm not going through a PowerPoint with you right now. What we know is that currently, if you fall into this category of people who are what we call new arrivals, people, and that term has a very specific definition. It's limited to people who entered the United States on or after March 15th of 2022. So in the last 3+ years, and they have a fear of returning to their home country. So we have seen, for instance, recent immigrants who came on a visa. The reason they're not here, we don't use the term asylum seekers, but that was the city's original conception. We didn't want to use that term because, as we'll talk about in a minute, the asylum process, has an end date, and we didn't want people to sort of be tied to that process and make it all about, what happened with their asylum application. But so we use the term new arrivals instead. But if you arrived here on or after March 15th of 2022 and you're afraid to return to your home country, then you fall in this group. And currently, and for the last couple of years, if you are in New York and you need a place to go, you don't have someone else to stay with, you go to the city's into what they call arrival center that serves this population. And the arrival center is in the Roosevelt Hotel, which is next to Grand Central. The address is 45 East 45th Street. The arrival center is going to close. It's going to close on by the end of June. The lease is up, and as of July 1st, they have to be out of there. So at some point in the next month or so, there are about 800 rooms there. All those folks are getting moved out, and also they won't be able to use the ground floor space as their intake office anymore. So we don't have this final commitment on this plan, but it appears that the plan is going to be that they're just going to stop having separate intake. And so for the first time in 3+ years, when new arrivals show up in New York, they'll go to regular DHS intake sites just like everybody else. This is a brand new development, and it may change again. The city is not, sort of committing to making that the final plan yet, but it seems likely, very likely, that is going to be what happens. So as of, maybe even sooner than July 1st, but definitely as of July 1st, we're going to be back in a world where everybody goes to regular DHS intake if they don't have another option for shelter. And so I'll just quickly outline those sites. But, again, you can always call 311. Families with children go to PATH, which is, or any household that has a pregnant person, even if it's one individual person. goes to Path, which is at 151 East 151st Street in the Bronx off the Grand Concourse. Um, Single adults who identify as men go to many people call it Bellevue, but it's near Bellevue Hospital. It's the old Bellevue Hospital. It's at 30th Street and First Avenue and in Manhattan, and the city calls it 30th Street. And that is men's intake. That is also the site of what they call the adult family intake. So families with no minor children go there with just adults in a household. And then there are two intake sites for single adults who identify as women, and those are one is in the Bronx on Franklin Avenue, and one is in Brooklyn. It's called Help Women's, and it is on Williams Avenue. Sorry. Both of those sites, both of the women's intake sites have some architectural barriers. So people who have mobility impairments probably should consult about whether they're going to be able to manage before they choose which one to go to. And we are available to help you if that's an issue for your client. So the sort of confusing message is that for right now, new arrivals who show up will go to the Roosevelt. And if that's the place you've been dealing with, that's what should be happening, except if they're adult families. Those go to I've already moved over to all of them going to the Adult Family Intake Center. And by July 1st, we should be back. We expect to be back in kind of the old world where everybody just goes to the regular DHS intake site for their for the population that they're in. Okay, so what are some other changes that are on the horizon? We currently we are living in a world where as I mentioned before, the housing programs that had been set up for people in the regular DHS shelter world, like city FEPs, et cetera, programs that you may have worked with for shelter clients, they're not available to people who don't have public assistance eligibility. And so at the start of this, there was a lot of difficulty around, sort of solving where were people going to go. But over time, what has evolved is that people who apply for asylum, we know, are eligible for public assistance because they are what we call in New York PRU-call. PRU-call is a term that is only used in New York and in public assistance advocacy. It doesn't mean anything to immigration lawyers. It doesn't mean anything to people outside New York, but it's a very important term that we use in New York. It stands for permanently residing under color of law. And it means that you are it's sort of the opposite of the term illegal that you hear all the time being used to apply to people. It means people do have a legal basis to be here. They're not illegal. And therefore, in New York law, they're entitled to public benefits. And so people who are PRU-call then can get public assistance, and therefore they can get city FEPs if they're in a DHS shelter. Whether this is another confusing part of what has arisen over time and what is changing. We have a regular DHS shelter system. We have a number of shelters that are currently being operated by all these other agencies that they created to sort of take up the wave of new people who were coming into the city who had not been in shelter before. In order to meet the need, New York City Department of Homeless Services also opened many new shelters to serve the new arrivals from the southern border. So, but which of these kinds of shelters you end up in was sort of random. If you came to intake and you needed a bed, they put you in a placement based on where there was available space, and that could be anywhere. So, as it worked out, the majority of people ended up in shelters that were operated by the Department of Homeless Services. So that means that those people are eligible for city FEPs because they're in a DHS shelter if they were to meet the other criteria of the program. Whereas people who are in these shelters that are operated by other agencies, like health and hospitals, are not, because city FEPs is only for people in DHS shelters. So what we see now going on in the city is an effort to move people from the shelters operated by other agencies and into DHS shelters as space becomes available. This has also been made possible by the huge reduction in the number of people coming to New York. I said earlier that there were, at one point there were 4,000 people a week arriving who were just these new arrivals from the southern border. Now we're down to more like 100 people a week or 150. So it's a much lower volume, but we still have 40,000 of these folks who are still in shelter in New York City, who have arrived over the last 3 years. And for those people who are not in shelters operated by DHS, the goal is to move them into shelters that are operated by DHS. And then at that point, if it is possible to get them housing subsidies if they qualify for those housing subsidies. There are other programs that people use to try to move out, but most of those include some component of federal funding. And so in the current world, that creates two problems. Number one is that the government is trying to restrict people's access to programs based on their immigration status. And number two, there are the Republicans in Congress are trying to cut the budgets of all these agencies, so we will have less assistance available overall for everyone. So between these two things, these folks are getting squeezed. We don't have the answer to how this is going to turn out. So this is, we said at the start of this that this is an evolving situation, and this is one of the major issues that we were talking about here, is that we don't know right now what assistance and what kind of assistance is going to be available to people in the future. But I think it's safe to assume that it's going to be state programs like city FEPs, and also there's a new housing subsidy that's included in the budget called HAVP, Housing Assistance Voucher Program. That should also be available to people. But again, we don't know exactly when it's going to be available, how people are going to get it. This is in the budget that just passed in Albany last week, I guess. So that's a brand new program as well. All of which is to say that right now the picture is very uncertain, and at the same time we have fewer people arriving, and the people who are here, on the one hand, they don't have anywhere to go. On the other hand, they're very nervous about the kinds of immigration enforcement that we're seeing, and so they're laying low, right? They are trying to avoid contact with government agencies as much as possible, and that also makes it challenging to help people get permanent housing, because that's been the route out of shelter for so long. Okay. I'm going to stop for 1 second and just see if people have any questions at this point before we talk about disabilities. Any hands?
Yeah, I haven't really seen any questions on the chat so far.
Okay. Let's talk about, hi, Kathleen.
I'm gonna unmute you, Kathleen.
Sorry. Hi, Josh. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. So you guys think the emergency order will end by July?
Okay. So let me back up and give a little context for this question, and thank you for that question. I talked before about how we reached an agreement with the city about what kinds of separate shelters they could offer to the new arrivals that would be have different rules than the existing shelters and shelter rules. And the structure of that agreement is that they're allowed to operate that parallel system while there's a crisis. They call it the crisis plan. And there are a couple elements of that, including what the shelters look like, how you get into them, this plan that I talked about before about people having to reapply every 30 or 60 days. All of that stuff is encompassed in what they call the crisis plan. And the crisis plan, it's called a crisis plan because it assumes that we are currently in a crisis, and at some point the crisis will end, and then they won't need this plan anymore, and we go back to the old rules. So it's very important to a lot of people, and that's why Kathleen is asking, is that when do we think that this crisis is going to be over? From the city's point of view, they have always said that the crisis is that they have so many more people in shelter than they were expecting, say, 3 years ago. Like they did not, in all of their planning, account for the idea that suddenly tens of thousands of people who had never been in New York before were going to be here and in need of shelter. And that number, so that's when I referred earlier to there being, close to 40,000 people. That's still where we are. And from their point of view, that's the crisis, that they have like basically twice as many people in shelter, and therefore the existing shelter system can't accommodate all those folks. Those numbers, as I said, are declining, but they're not declining as quickly as I think we all might have hoped. We see that many fewer people are arriving in New York, but a lot of the people who came are, for reasons that we all know and understand, are having trouble moving out of shelter. I need to tell everyone on this call, the job market is difficult, the housing market is difficult, the assistance programs that exist are difficult to access. It's extremely challenging to move out of shelter. So I think from the city's point of view, that underlying crisis is still present. And we didn't define exactly when, what's the magic number when you can say, okay, this isn't really a crisis anymore. But to have basically twice as many people as they were counting on, I think from their point of view, is clearly a crisis. On the other hand, what are the kinds of things that they are able to do under the crisis plan? Well, a big one was that they could operate this separate intake site at the Roosevelt Hotel, and they could do this reapplication center that they call reticketing in the East Village. That's where people, single adults who, and adult families who had reached the 30 or 60 days, had to go to get a new placement. Many people called it St. Bridget's. It was in the old St. Bridget's school, for those of you who've dealt with it or followed the story. Excuse me. If they're going to go back to a world where everybody goes to regular DHS intake, from everything we've seen, well, first of all, that eliminates one big part of it, right? Everybody just goes to the regular intake site. The next question is, where do they get placed? And then what rules apply to them in those placements? What we've seen is that DHS has been extremely resistant to treating people differently within their own system. So, without having any commitment from them, I think what seems likely to happen is that many people who come in who are new, who will go to intake, get assigned to a regular DHS shelter bed, and they will be in DHS for all intents and purposes. At the same time, because they have so many people who are still in the existing old shelters that they set up, they're going to need to keep running those sites. And DHS does not want to take over the sites. So the agencies that are currently in charge will still be in charge for as long as they have to stay open. And those agencies will probably continue to use their own rules. Now, how they can administer that when they don't have a separate intake site, we'll see. Are they going to give up on the 30 and 60-day thing? They won't tell us that. But what we've seen is that the city's not really getting anything out of that process. Most people, almost everybody is getting a new placement. They're spending a lot of money to operate this reticketing center, and it doesn't deter people. people who need shelter are still coming back and saying, I need shelter, and they're getting a bed because they're entitled to it. So it's from the city's point of view, it's actually pretty wasteful to continue to operate this thing. And so given what they have told us, it seems likely that they're gonna stop sending people through that process. But they have not committed to that yet. So we don't know for sure. So, if we get to a world where people are going to the regular intake, they're getting placed in regular shelters, they're being treated like everybody else, the crisis plan might still exist on paper, and it might still apply to those people who are still in that shrinking parallel ghost shelter system. But hopefully it will apply to fewer and fewer people over time, and it will sort of naturally go away when it becomes more of a burden for the city to operate it than it's worth to them. And I'll also say that a big part of this, of course, is what happens with immigration enforcement. I mean, we see right now the administration is trying to get Congress to approve, a tenfold increase in the budget of immigration enforcement. That would potentially, and they're also trying to retract people's status. People who have, for instance, TPS or another reason, or even they've applied for asylum. They want to change all the rules. And so if we end up in a world where they've removed the status for so many people, and they have, they have the ability to actually, detain and deport many more people, then I think we're just going to be looking at a very different picture also. I mean, a very scary, terrifying world, but that's what they said they wanted to do, and that's what they've asked Congress to do, and they control both houses of Congress. So it's entirely possible that the world will get a lot darker sooner, and then how that will affect the number of people who are in shelter in New York. I mean, people may disappear, they may be detained. I mean, we just don't know. And I think there's not any point in speculating about how that could all play out. There's a zillion scenarios, but I just think it's important to keep in mind that, we're living in a world right now that could be changed drastically in the not too distant future. Did that answer your question, Kathleen?
Okay. Yes, it did. That was really helpful. Just to make sure I process it correctly. So like the emergency order is going to stay in place for like intensive purposes of like this parallel system still operating, but they're going to close the intake and route everyone to DHS to not really have that parallel system grow, and that people can now, once coming in, have access to the subsidies if Pru call.
Um, I think that is correct.
Okay.
And the most likely outcome, but they haven't committed to that.
Okay.
And they, even the people who seem to be in charge say things like, look, anything could change at any time. And I think, again, what they're thinking about is what is going to happen in Congress. Are we going to, lose all our funding for the programs we have? Are we going to, start some kind of mass surveillance program that involves sweeping people up? Are we going to revoke their status so that they can be detained? Are we going to build giant camps to detain people and shift from a world of shelters to a world of detention camps? I mean, these are all horrifying scenarios, but they're not impossible to imagine in this world.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So grim, but really appreciate you clarifying, and glad that folks will at least be getting access to some subsidies.
Yeah, and I think, Josh, just to clarify, when we're talking about DHS here, we're talking about just for Department of Homeless Services, not Department of Homeland Security.
Yes, and thank you. I try to be very careful about that in writing and in talking, particularly depending on who the audience is. Sometimes I forget to do that. So this is a super confusing part of this topic, which is that it's the intersection of two agencies called DHS, right? The New York City Department of Homeless Services and the federal U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Okay, it looks like Nicole has a question.
I think I just unmuted. You should
Yeah,
be able
can
to.
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have a few questions. Maybe some of them you'll get to, but I'm curious how new arrivals find out about the arrival center.
Okay, let me answer that one first. And this is maybe a digression, but the city is really uninterested in that question. And just so you know, to go into the history of a little bit, for a long time, most people were arriving at the Port Authority at the beginning. Most people were arriving at the Port Authority bus terminal. And the mayor went on TV and said, Texas is chartering buses and sending people here. And that actually wasn't true. People were coming on regular scheduled buses. But somebody was buying them tickets. And then later, Texas did in fact charter lots of buses and send them to the Port Authority. But soon after that, most people were arriving by air. And so the Port Authority police, because the airports are all controlled by the Port Authority, were dealing with people getting off a plane, not knowing where to go or what to do. And so kind of a network arose. There were some mutual aid groups on site at the Port Authority who managed to connect with individual Port Authority police officers, and they were literally arranging individual Uber or rideshare rides from the airports to intake because the city wanted no part of it. They were totally uninterested. At one point, they got a bus from when they moved when they and at the start of this, they were doing the intake at the Port Authority bus terminal. And so people who arrived by air had to get to the Port Authority bus terminal to get a placement. But then they opened the arrival center at the Roosevelt Hotel. And when they started that, they got a bus. The state gave them a bus to transport people from the Port Authority at 34th and 8th to the Roosevelt at 45th and Madison. And after a while, the state took their bus back and the city wouldn't even transport people from the Port Authority to the Roosevelt. They didn't want to tell anyone about it. They didn't want to take anyone there. They just relied on word of mouth and mutual aid groups spreading the news. And, what we found is that the new arrival households are very effectively networked through WhatsApp. So information got out.
Got it. Thank you. And I'm also curious who is responsible for the decision to renew or not renew the lease for Roosevelt Hotel. Is it Adams? Is it like a group of people or agencies?
Yeah, I mean it's a private negotiation, so we don't know for sure, but the from what city officials have told us, their story is that the landlord did not want to renew. And again, another maybe a little digression, but the Roosevelt Hotel is a 1,000-room hotel right next to Grand Central that I didn't know existed before this. And it had been many years before since anyone had been staying there. It had been just closed and empty. So as a result, and it's owned by Pakistan Airways.
Well,
So out of all of this, I guess people woke up to the fact that this thing existed. And so maybe there's like some actual business purpose that they have for it. And so they're building back. Maybe they're going to knock it down and build a new tower. Chase is building a giant office building on the next block. So maybe it's suddenly a desirable site. We don't know. But that the folks who work there, the agencies that operate it, were very unhappy that they were losing it. And so I think that if they could have renewed, they would have. But of course, the decision ultimately would be made at City Hall, even if the agencies wanted to do it. If City Hall didn't, then that would be that. But at least what they've suggested is that the owner wants it back and just doesn't want to renew the lease.
okay, thank you. And my last question, sorry to take up so much time. This one is maybe less of a digression. Feel free to skip over it if you'll get to it. I'm curious if there's some obligation for like a long-term income plan for new arrivals who secure housing. And if so, how would that work considering like any work authorization barriers?
So the entire this entire problem that we have had, at least through the current administration and the prior administration, was that under US law, people can be admitted to the US, but they are not authorized to work. So all these folks were, crossing the border, presenting themselves, being given an appointment to show up in immigration court. So they're admitted to the United States, but they are not authorized to work. And in order to correct that, we need an act of Congress. And that was definitely not happening in the Biden administration because they actually negotiated a deal and Trump told the Republicans to reject it at their own deal because he didn't want to hand Biden a win on immigration. So they affirmatively kept it the mess that it was because they thought it was politically advantageous. Now, it seems like they don't want to give anyone anything. And they're trying to revoke people's ability to work. So all of that is tied to those are federal questions. There's nothing that the state or the city can do to make people eligible to work. What the state and the city can do currently is that depending on, again, if you have if you're in a legal pathway, you can be Pru-Call, you can get benefits, and therefore you can get city FEMS. But, you may not be able to get Section 8 or NYCHA housing. And in fact, they want to make it more difficult for people who are in what we call mixed households, people who have some, U.S. citizen or lawful permanent residents in their household, and some people who are not. And they're trying to make, the current administration is trying to make those rules more difficult, more challenging for people. And that will only leave state assistance. So the question is going to be, we're heading into a world where Congress wants to dramatically cut the funding for all kinds of programs that we rely on. And when that happens, what is the state going to do with its remaining limited dollars? Are we going to raise taxes and keep all the programs that we have, but pay for them entirely out of state money? That seems unlikely. More likely, they're going to start cutting stuff. And what are they going to cut first? Are they going to cut programs that help our clients, or are they going to cut programs that help middle class and wealthy people? I think we know how that's likely to go. So, once we get through the federal budget world, we're then going to be dealing with infighting at the state and city level, where there's massive cuts to revenue that we've always relied on from the federal government. And the question is going to be, how do we make it up? And so I think it's extremely unlikely that the solution to that is going to be, that the federal government authorizes all of these folks to be able to work now and makes it easier for the state and the city to provide assistance. I think that, that's the least likely scenario at this point. But, again, we don't know. So it's hard to sort of give a presentation about the current world without having to say all this could change for the worse soon. And stay tuned.
Okay, thank you so much.
I don't see any other questions for now.
Okay, so let's talk about disability for a minute. And I'm sorry, give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
In the meantime, just to let everyone know, if you have any questions, for anyone who came in later, we are live streaming this meeting, but we are taking questions throughout. So if you have any questions, put it in the chat.
Or you can raise your hand too.
Yes.
Okay, disability rights in shelter, particularly as it affects this population. So we have another case, which is called Butler versus City of New York, which requires the New York City shelter system to accommodate people's disabilities. And that means that they have to offer you what's called a reasonable accommodation if there's some aspect of shelter that they need to change in order to make it possible for you to access shelter. And this derives from federal law that applies to all government programs. It's not just a New York City shelter thing. So when they were setting up the shelters for the new arrivals, initially, and we said, well, what's your plan? They wanted to make this whole new shelter system, which meant that they had to make all new rules. It seems kind of wasteful considering they already had these agencies that operated shelters and had a full set of rules, and we wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel. But for whatever reason, some of which we already talked about, they wanted to make a new shelter system. Okay, so if they're going to do that, they need to have rules for people with disabilities too, to make sure that they can access shelter. So their initial response was, well, this population isn't going to be disabled because they walk through the Darien Gap. So if they were disabled, they wouldn't have made it. This was a really kind of horrifying response. In the first place, there are all kinds of disabilities, and they're not limited to the kinds of things that would prevent you from walking through the jungle for 3 days. But also, a lot of people were disabled because they crossed through the Darien Gap. And a lot of people came, that was when at the start of this, most people were coming from Venezuela, from Ecuador, from Colombia, Peru. But now we have people coming from all over the world, from West Africa, from Asia, and from the Caribbean. So, not everybody is coming through the Darien Gap. And also, it's federal law. You have to accommodate people's disabilities. So what has evolved over time is that there are a number of rules, a number of ways throughout this process that people who have disabilities should be able to bring that up, to have that information stored so that they don't have to constantly be reminding the staff that they have a disability, and they should be exempt from certain kinds of rules. So we like to make sure that advocates are aware that it's a very important part of the screening when working with clients to ask people, is there anything that you're going to need help with? People don't always know the word disability or what it means, but it's important to identify if there's any particular barrier that your client is going to have, whether it's related to mobility and architectural barriers and that kind of thing, like a wheelchair is the sort of most obvious example, or it could be a mental health issue as well. That's still a disability. And if the person's disability is obvious or apparent, then the city has to accommodate it on the spot. If you are using a wheelchair and they tell you to, go someplace that involves using stairs, then you shouldn't have to provide any documentation to show them that you need that. It's obvious that you are using the wheelchair and can't get over the stairs. There are some disabilities that are not obvious and apparent, and the city takes the view that mental health disabilities in particular are not obvious or apparent. That's not always true, but the consequence of it not being obvious or apparent is that the city may require the person to document what is their disability, what accommodation do they need, and what is the relationship between those two things. So if you're working with a client who's going to need an accommodation, you want to start as soon as possible. If you think that there's going to be any question about whether or not they are in need of this accommodation, that they have some kind of documentation there. So some examples are people who take psychotropic medications need air conditioning because the medication affects their body's ability to regulate their temperature. We have people with autism spectrum disorder who can't sit through long meetings or need privacy. Recently we've been doing a lot of work with trans clients around their needs, where this is a question this becomes a legal question about sort of what is technically a disability and what is a need that they have for another reason. But the city, although at the highest levels, they say that they want to be supportive. In practice, a lot of trans clients are experiencing a lot of difficulty with the kinds of shelter placements that they get. And that applies both to the Department of Homeless Services and to the non-DHS shelters for new arrivals. So if you have anybody who's going to need something out of the ordinary, it could be that you need a placement in a particular part of the city. That's, the accommodation that you need because you need to access your doctor, or because you need to not be in a particular community because it's triggering for you, or you're not going to be safe there. That wouldn't be a disability issue, but another kind of thing that you might want to be asking for and need to document. So we encourage people to start as early as possible in collecting what they're going to need to make that case. And again, it's not enough to just have a letter from a doctor that just says, these are the diagnoses of my patient. You have to kind of spell it all out for them. You have to say, let's take asthma for an example. My patient has asthma. Their asthma trigger is heat. Therefore, they need to be in a room that has an air conditioner. So you need all three of those elements. You need to be able to say, what is the disability? What is the thing that they need? And what is the connection between those two things? How does the accommodation that you're asking for address the disability? And it's a lot of work to get, you have to get their doctor on the phone. It has to be somebody who is familiar with the patient, somebody who's willing to listen to you, and even, go back and forth with you while you try to get them to improve the language that they propose. And, it takes time. So that's why we always take a moment to strongly encourage people to, get to work on that as soon as they've identified that it's something they're going to need. Any questions about that? Okay, I want to talk about one other new development, which is for people in the regular DHS shelter system who are not new arrivals, but people who've been here longer but have a mixed status or are undocumented in some way. So what we've seen is that the longest staying families in the Department of Homeless Services, some people who've been in shelter for 4 years, are people who don't have any kind of status that enables them to get public assistance. They are not PRUCAL, and they can't get public assistance, and therefore they can't get city FEPS. And so now they're really stuck. They're certainly not going to qualify for Section 8 or federal program. In theory, they could get supportive housing if they have that kind of need, but if they're able-bodied, they just don't have any immigration status, then the only way that they're going to get out of shelter is to save their money from wages. And of course, in New If you're undocumented, your earning potential is very low. So that's why people are stuck for so long. In the state legislature appropriated money to address this a while ago, and it took the city a long time, but they have finally implemented a program that they call SHARE, which is a housing subsidy for people in this situation. Now, this is not something that you can apply for. They have taken the list of the families who have been in shelter the longest and started at the back, and they are working their way forward, and they are offering people this subsidy. It is meant to look like city FEPS and basically work like city FEPS, but only be available to people in the situation. It's either a mixed household or there's no status at all in the household. And so if you work with these clients, you may see these shopping letters that they call them, the letter that you get to take to a landlord and say, hey, I have a housing subsidy. can I rent an apartment? They say that it's going very well. They haven't given it to very many people yet, but they've already had some folks move out. They have, people who've been waiting for years, trying to get out of the shelter system. They've now been handed the opportunity to do that, and they are going for it. So if you are working with families in the shelter system who aren't eligible for any public assistance, can't get city FEPs, even if they're working, and they have been there a long time, we could probably check on whether, when they're going to get to them. Or if maybe they even got it already and they've, you've seen the papers and you're trying to figure out what this is. Again, you can't apply for it. They're going to call you. But if you think they should have called you, then you can reach out to them or you can let us know and we can reach out to them and see if this is something that is available to the clients you're working with. But again, they're trying to serve the longest staying households first. And they are to answer, Kathleen is asking, could an elderly single adult be eligible? It's possible. I think they started with the families because there are more people. But they are planning to, they said, as they sort of work through the list, get to other household compositions. So it is possible that would work. And if we want to check in about like how long has that person been in shelter, other compelling facts, maybe we could sort of highlight that and get them to at least tell us when they think they would get to that person. Okay, so that program again is called Share. They haven't posted anything online about it because again, you can't apply for it. They don't want people to think that they should be applying for it and start calling them like, how do I get this? But they have a limited amount of money that was appropriated by the legislature, and it took them way too long to get it set up, but they have it going now, and people are moving out. So that is, it's a little ray of sunshine. It's also a good model, and it proves that it can work. Again, with the new state subsidy, that should also be available to people regardless of their immigration status. So hopefully, we can demonstrate that works, and that can be, a model. It can be expanded. It's a lot easier, I think, to expand something that exists rather than to try to create something new. So there's a question, is this particular voucher only for those who are living in a shelter? The answer is yes. It's called, again, the program is called Share, and it is for people who are in shelter, who are the longest staying households. And those are, I'm not going to say entirely, but almost entirely people who are, the reason that they're the longest staying households is because they are either, there's no person in the family who has status, or it's a mixed status family and the math just doesn't work. If you have one person who has status and three people who don't, really challenging, even with with like a prorated subsidy for the people who are eligible for it, to find housing and pay for it with that limited resource. So if we can get these new programs rolling and show that they're successful and they keep people out of shelter, then maybe we can get them renewed. But again, all of this has this looming cloud of, we're preparing for a world with both significant federal cuts and also limitations on who is eligible for what. And so all of this will make it much more difficult to use federal resources, which will put more pressure on the state, which will mean, choices having to be made, right, about what is the state going to pay for in the future. And in order to preserve what we have or expand what we have, it's going to require, a huge effort at a time when every other constituency in the state is also fighting to preserve what they have. Other questions there? Okay. Well, those are the hot topics, I would say, in housing and shelter rights for immigrants and new arrivals. If there are other kinds of questions about the shelter system or other ways I can be helpful, happy to open it up.
Yeah, you can raise your hand if you have a question. I was just wondering, and it's probably too early, but I don't know if they released a decision on the birthright citizenship thing today, or if you know
Okay,
anything about it.
sure. Let me think of where to start on this. It has been not disputable. It is clear. It has been known for over 150 years that a person who is born in the United States is a United States citizen. This is not controversial. But the Trump administration doesn't care about reality or history. They want to change that. And so their first strategy for changing that was just putting out an executive order, which is just a statement by the president that says that's no longer true. Now, he does not have the power to change the Constitution, but he acts like he does. So immediately, I think there are 40 different cases now pending on this. They got sued every way to Sunday about this blatantly wrong executive order that the president issued. Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard arguments about this executive order, and technically, the issue that was before the Supreme Court was limited to what can the courts do about this situation? If normally, when the government does something, somebody thinks it's illegal, they sue the government, they win or they lose, that decision can be appealed. If you win or lose the appeal, you can try to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. That usually takes years and years. There is, the court does have the ability, while all those cases are sort of rolling, to say, I'm going to stop this for now. And if at the end of your case, you lose and we decide actually it is legal, then it can go into effect. But while this is being fought out in the courts, we're going to prevent the government from implementing this thing. So that's what happened here. People immediately filed cases and they said, not only is this illegal, but you have to stop them immediately from doing it, because otherwise we're going to have chaos. If different states have different rules, the lawyer for the state of New Jersey yesterday said New Jersey has, I forget if it was 4,000 or 8,000 children born to New Jersey residents in other states in the course of a year. So they come, they're away on business, they're at school, whatever. They're not in New Jersey when they're born in another state. And then they, ask New Jersey for whatever, a birth certificate. I don't know. New Jersey eventually figures out that they were born somewhere else and has to deal with it. So, if those kids were born in a state where that state believes that there's no birthright citizenship, are they citizens? What if they come back to New Jersey? Are they now citizens because New Jersey does recognize birthright citizenship? It just doesn't make any sense to have a world where different states have different rules about who's a citizen. So therefore, it's the perfect example for what we call a nationwide injunction. You go to a judge and say, you have to say that not only can they not do this to me, they can't do this to anyone in the whole country until this case is resolved, which will take years. So the Trump administration went directly to the Supreme Court and said, we know it's going to take a while to litigate these cases all the way, but in the meantime, we should be allowed to implement this thing. Now, in some situations, the court might say, okay, well, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt and let you implement it. And if it later turns out that it's illegal at the end of the case, then, we'll say that then. But here, again, there is no plausible legal argument that the Trump administration is correct. It's just crystal clear that anyone born in the United States is a US citizen. So everyone knows that they're going to lose in the end. And so the only question is, will the courts allow them to implement the illegal rules in those states where that are willing to go along with this until it gets to the Supreme Court the proper way, in 2 or 3 years, and then the Supreme Court can say, yeah, no, that was totally wrong. You would think that this would be a very easy thing for the court to deal with, but as we saw yesterday, they were very confused about how to handle the situation. We don't know how long it's going to take them to write a decision. We don't know what it's going to say. It seems like the easiest thing for them to do would just be to say, look, there's no point in having this conversation about what can courts do while a case is pending, because everyone knows that this is ridiculous legal argument. And so we're just going to tell you right now at the very start of the case and get it over with. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen, period, end of story. There's no point in fighting about what that means. We don't know when they're going to make a decision. It's at least going to be a couple weeks. But the outcome of that case, the thing that would be most disruptive would be if the court says, we're not reaching the question right now of whether or not Trump is right that people who are born in the United States might not be citizens depending on who their parents are. But we are going to let him implement his dumb rule for now until the case can sort of work its way up through the courts. If they were to do that, he's going to say, I was right, and I'm going to start implementing it. And then, it may be 2 or 3 years before the court finally says, no, that's wrong. And in the meantime, the damage will have been done and he'll have claimed victory and it'll be a big mess. And I think the court did figure that out yesterday, that was what was going to happen if they didn't straighten this out now. But we just don't know.
Okay, so like anyone in a mixed family household, the citizen children are still, as of right now, eligible for all benefits, like nothing has been determined yet.
Yes, there has never been a question. There is no plausible legal argument that someone born in the United States is not a citizen. Now, they could amend the United States Constitution. That's very difficult, but in theory, that's something that they could do, and they could change the rules. But currently, the rule is if you're in the United States when you're born, you are a citizen. And nothing has changed that. What their executive order was telling the states that they should make rules about who gets to be a citizen and how, and they have 30 days to prepare new rules. So even if they got to do what it is that they want to do, it's going to take weeks or months for it all to play out. There will be litigation. I guarantee you it will never go into effect in New York. Anybody here is safe and will continue to be safe because this is so crazy. But, depending on what the Supreme Court does with this request, and we have some judges who, have backed up Trump in the past when they should not have. If they were to issue a ruling that says we don't think that courts should be prohibiting, a court in one state should prohibit the whole country from having this rule at the start of a case, then that could mean that in some states they could start to say, that denying that certain children were citizens, and then those children would then have to sue to sort of win back their citizenship or to force the government to acknowledge it. And so that could be a huge mess. But in New York, I don't think it's going to be a problem for people, because New York is going to always recognize the reality that those are the rules.
Thank you for that. And I was just wondering if you could talk about people who are permanent residents and like the limitations they have with cash assistance. Like I know there's sometimes with like that you have to wait a certain number of years to be eligible for certain type of benefits. If you could just give a general guideline.
Yes. So there is a wonderful chart, which I'm going to try to look up in another window. So forgive my clicking. But uh, this is a complicated area, and for each person, you want to review and make sure that you um, know what the person's immigration status is, and then that can tell you what kinds of benefits they're eligible for. So, obviously, citizens entitled to everything. Lawful permanent resident would be the sort of next best category. They're entitled to almost everything, and then people who have less than lawful permanent residence, is where it gets complicated. But let me find that chart for you and I will put it in the chat. And I'll just say that, again, lawful permanent residents are in the best position. And then it's sort of from there are limitations. Okay, so here is the latest chart. And I'm just going to put that in the chat. And hopefully referring to this can answer your questions. It's pretty easy to work. It starts at the top with lawful permanent resident and then works its way down. So refugees would be the next category. There are weird subcategories like Cuban and Haitian entrants under a particular statute. Canadian-born Native Americans is another category. It's very technical, so it's hard to generalize. But you could scroll down through many different categories, all the way to the bottom, which is no lawful status. And even people with no lawful status are entitled to emergency Medicaid and children's health insurance CHIP. That's all the way at the bottom. So there's, nobody isn't there's under current law, there is no category of people who are not entitled to anything. And I'm also going to put my email address in the chat. I think I said I was going to do that earlier and I didn't. If anyone wants to follow up on any of these questions.
I think in housing, the one question we always get is about the one-shot deal. So again, it might be like too nuanced for you to say, but like a permanent residence, would they be eligible for that? Or is it like a 5-year limit or something like that they have to wait?
I am not an expert on this question, so I don't want to give the wrong answer. But if you have a particular case, we can follow up. People, I think there's also different kinds of grants there. So, the city's primary interest is in confirming that you have the ability to pay the rent in the future. And that is often tied up in your immigration status as well. So I think it's a more complicated question than just what is your immigration status. But that's not something that I deal with every day, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer. If you have a particular case, feel free to reach out and we will try to get you the answer.
Yeah, if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or okay, so Afia, I hope I'm saying your name right. I'm gonna unmute you. And you should be able to talk now.
Hi, good afternoon. Afia here. I just wanted you to repeat what you said about the medication aspect, if what they can and can't do. Because a
So
lot of people call when working on the helpline, and people always call about like if the landlord takes, well, I know this is about shelter and housing, like what they do, like if they cut their lights and they have medication inside, and it's always a concern. So I just wanted you to repeat what you said about that, right? But when it comes to shelter and stuff.
okay, so I think I hear two different questions, so tell me if I didn't answer them. Let me start first with the shelter question. lots of people in shelter have medication. There are some rules around depending on what kind of medication you have. And so if you have, for instance, if you're prescribed an opioid medication, then it may be that the shelter wants to keep it and dispense it to you so that, you don't have it stolen from you. And then there are issues with durable medical equipment, like if people have an oxygen tank, you can't have that in a congregate shelter. There's a lot of people smoking, and they don't want explosions. So there are, in general, the rule should be that people can have access to their medication, but there are, sort of reasonable restrictions that the city can place on how you store or use your medications or your equipment in shelter. And if your client is having a problem with that, let us know, and we can help try to solve that. From the permanent housing point of view, if you have like a medication that needs to be refrigerated, for instance, or if you're in shelter and you need to have your medication refrigerated, then the shelter should do that for you. You may not have access to a refrigerator, where you sleep, but they have a refrigerator somewhere and they can store your medication and give it to you when you are ready to take it. For tenants in permanent housing, if you are in danger of losing your utilities, I mean, that can happen in two ways. One is that you're responsible for utilities and the utility is claiming that you owe them money. And sometimes we see that the landlord is responsible for utilities and they stop paying, and then the tenants get a notice that the power is going to get cut off or whatever, the gas, because the landlord hasn't paid the bill. So those utilities, depending on the scenario, have programs to protect people with disabilities. So you should, if you have that kind of problem with a tenant, I don't know, you should have the referrals there are programs that assist people with utility problems. And I would start there. But people should know that if they have, for instance, to use your example, medication that needs to be refrigerated and they've received some kind of turn-off notice that says that the service is going to be cut, the utilities do have ways for people to preserve their access to the utilities, to their, to the power or whatever it is they need, if they have a disability that requires that they need the access to the power. So, we should make sure that people are reaching out about that. And let me look, I'm gonna look. I think that my main referral here might be out of date. So I'm going to look for the current one and just put in the chat. But the resource that you would reach out to if you have a problem with your utilities in New York. And it looks like they changed the name to New York's Utility Project. Yeah, here we go. So I would start here if you have somebody who is in permanent housing and is facing a cutoff that is going to impede their ability to manage their medication or use their equipment. And I'll just say that we've seen, in the current budget, Republicans are proposing to cut funding for this kind of assistance also. So this is another area where, we know what to tell you now, but it could be a lot worse in the near future.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
So I think one scenario is if immigrants who live in permanent housing and their landlords are making threats against them because maybe any type of issues arise and they make threats to call ICE or something. Would that count as harassment in a housing court case? What other options does that immigrant person have?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing this as the immigration
Hey, Levi, what do you
enforcement
want to make?
efforts become
Hey, Levi, what do you want to make?
more aggressive and better resourced. then that inspires people to use them against people. So we've seen that happen for sure. And I imagine it will get worse. The your question, what your answer in your question was right. That would definitely be harassment. It would be harassment that you could complain about to the New York City Human Rights Commission or the state, and you could certainly present that as evidence of retaliation in housing court. You know, it's not it, the housing court can't control, and the state and city human rights commission can't control what ICE does. So it's possible that the efforts by a landlord or manager or whoever to contact them would be effective. I mean, we're going to see people who are detained in these kinds of situations, and there's nothing that the city or state or the housing court can do about that. But it would also be true that it is harassment and illegal retaliation and discrimination. So to the extent that people can get relief through those, channels, they should do that.
Okay. And then I think my only other question would be, has there recently been any rollback in language assistance within the courthouses or in the service of the shelter access? Um, I know of, like the bigger spectrum, there has been some language assistance program rollback, but I don't know with the New York City and the shelter system.
So currently, under New York law, New York City law, the city is required to provide materials in the 10 most common languages and provide interpreters. They use a service called Language Line to do telephonic translation, and they're supposed to be interpreters in court. These services are not the best, but they are required. They're supposed to be available to people. There's not been any reduction in the obligations of the city here. So I would say if you're experiencing problems with that, you can let us know. We've done some work on this in the past. I know other organizations have as well, and happy to, look at what the issue is and try to come up with a plan to address it. But the bottom line is that there is no official cutback of anything. So we should, treat that as a problem.
And even in shelter, they have to be provided interpretation services.
Yes,
Correct?
and
Okay.
again, that can be on the phone. I mean, they use this service called Language Line, and Language Line is not a city agency; it's a private contractor. Sometimes we call them, and they say, if when you call, the recording says, press 1 if you need Spanish. So they usually have a Spanish interpreter ready to go at any moment. But then, we've had people coming from, as I said, countries all over the world, countries where where people speak languages that there are fewer speakers of in New York. And so for some languages, it has been challenging for a Language Line to come up with someone. Sometimes they want to make an appointment. There's even, I can tell you that Bambara, they have told us we just don't have an interpreter for that. So that's not an excuse for them, but it is a practical problem. So, we can force them. The agreement that we have with them regarding the new arrival shelters says that people are supposed to get everything in their preferred language, period. It doesn't say, unless that language is really obscure and we can't find an interpreter, it just says they're supposed to get the communications in their preferred language. So at least in the new arrival shelters, they have a clear obligation that they have to do it. And so if you are encountering a problem with that, let us know.
And then is there any way that like in court or something, like let's say a stipulation agreement is written out and like they'll explain it to them right then and there. Is there any way they could request that there be an additional section written out in their preferred language by the interpreter or no?
I don't know what the courts require people to do, but certainly the first time someone is in court, or the first opportunity that they have, they should bring to the court's attention that they need an interpreter and tell the court what language that is. I mean, I think there's no excuse for, the court, nothing in court has to happen on any particular day. They can always adjourn it for an interpreter to be present. And but they need to know that they need to get that interpreter. And they have, the court is the same, right? They have Spanish interpreters all the time, but if they need an interpreter for another language, they may need some lead time. So they should, but that should be on the record. They should be made aware of that, and they should attempt to comply with it. And if they're refusing, then we definitely want to know.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, yeah, they sign something, have the interpreter interpret for them, but then they take it home and it's written in English and they're like, wait, what does it mean again? I want
Yeah,
to
I
look at
think
it,
the
but
interpreter is not gonna, they're definitely oral interpreters there,
mhm.
and they may not be qualified to prepare a translation of a document, a legal document in that way. I I'm trying to think of another resource that would be available, but at a minimum, people could go to the office of the legal services provider that day um, and raise this and try to brainstorm about how to get somebody who can prepare a, a document that would enable the person to understand what they sign.
Any other questions? Give everybody a minute. In the meantime, I am going to, we have some other trainings coming up, so feel free to check them out. But also, if you have a client, we have Housing Court Answers has some weekly trainings for tenants themselves. Because I know some of our advocate training can be a little bit complicated for them to understand. So I am gonna post that link on the chat, and you can check out our schedule. So we have trainings on holdover cases, getting repairs, and speaking of language, we have some of those trainings in Spanish for tenants directly. So I posted the link here, and we have trainings pretty much almost every day. I think the next one is on the 20th, which is getting repairs, how to get a lawyer, and the 21st. I don't speak Spanish, but it's como obtener un abogado for and then the other one I know is for rent assistance. I believe the first one is to get a lawyer, but it's in Spanish. So in that case, I would have needed an interpreter, but um, feel free to check those trainings out and refer to anyone who may need it. And then we have some other trainings that are coming up for advocates. We actually added a new one to our NYCHA series talking about NYCHA terminations. So definitely feel free to check out our remaining training series for the rest of the spring training series. And sorry, I think they posted the same link again. Yeah, and so we have a no grounds holdover that's coming on May 21st, but feel free to check that out. But if anybody else has any other questions, um and just remember this training will be posted on our website on the second link I sent. Uh and so if you need to reference back to anything, none of the documents will be shared on the website. Although I think I can put like the utility one, attach it. That's fine, right, Josh? The utility project.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can just put that on the website. But otherwise, will have a reference to the video on our website. But yeah, anything else? Okay, so I don't think we have any other questions. Thank you so much, Josh. This was a very super informative training. I know I learned a lot of new things I did not know, and hopefully nothing else changes so that we can reference your training again.
I think for sure things will change, but we can always come back and update.
Definitely. All right, everyone, have a great day and thank you so